I'm here at Elkhorn Creek near Frankfort. It's a beautiful day. All the trees are leafing out. There's lots of migrant birds coming through, lots of warblers and things like that. I'm going to tell you about a part of the natural world in Kentucky that you may not know as much about. If you've ever spent any time on a river or a creek in Kentucky, you've probably found shells. You might have found shells. Well, these are freshwater mussels, or clams, or bivalves, or whatever you want to call them. A lot of people don't even know that we have clams or shells in freshwater in Kentucky. I remember as a kid being amazed the first time I found mussel shells in a creek. I thought you had to go to the ocean or the beach to find shells, and I was really surprised that we have shells and mussels here in Kentucky in our own backyard. Not only does Kentucky have mussels, but we've got one of the highest mussel diversities of anywhere on Earth. There's about 300 mussel species in all of North America, but the vast majority of those occur in the eastern part of the U.S., especially in the southeast. So the states of Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia each have over 100 mussel species. This is more than in the Amazon or the Congo or other rivers and tropical regions that we normally associate with higher biodiversity. Just for example, in the entire Ohio River Basin, which includes most of Kentucky, there's about 400 fish species. But in the Amazon River Basin, there's over 3,000 fish species. But that's not the case with freshwater mussels. Here in Kentucky, we're actually in the rainforest when it comes to freshwater mussel diversity. So freshwater mussels are a really extraordinary part of our natural heritage here in Kentucky. This part of Elkhorn Creek here has about 20 mussel species. So just to put that in context for you in another way, the entire continent of Europe has only about 15 mussel species. So if I were to spend an hour or so really looking around carefully here, I could find more mussel species in this one little area than in all of Europe. And in some of the larger streams in Kentucky, like the Licking or the Green, you can find 30 or 40 species or more in one little area like this. So I think that's pretty extraordinary. But just another example of how extraordinary our mussel fauna is here in a global context. So I've talked about their high diversity, but mussels are also important ecologically. Mussels are filter feeders, so they pump water into their bodies, they extract oxygen and food and pump it back out. The way this works is when they pump the water into their bodies, it passes across their gills. And their gills are like a fine mesh. And so that filters out all the particles in the water, most of the particles. So things like algae, sediment particles, etc. So they don't necessarily eat all this stuff. They have kind of an interesting and elaborate way of picking out the stuff that they like. And the rest of the stuff, they expel it out onto the bottom of the stream. So you might think this sounds kind of gross, like mussels are expelling all this gunk out on the bottom of the stream, but it's really not like that. And that stuff is really important. By taking that material out of the water in suspension and putting it into the bottom, it becomes available for all the animals that live in the bottom of the stream. So it becomes a food source for microorganisms, insects, crayfish or crawdads, and all these other critters in the bottom of the stream. Those animals in turn are a food source for fishes, game fishes, and other things. So mussels are really an integral part of the ecosystem in a healthy stream, at least in this part of the world. Well, let's go look for some mussels. There's a couple of ways that we do this. Mussels can be kind of inconspicuous and hard to find because they live most of their lives buried almost completely in the bottom of a stream. So if this is the top, if this is the bottom of the stream and all the gravel and everything's under here, mussels will typically be buried almost all the way with just the tip of the shell poking out like this. Just enough that they can access the water overhead for filter feeding. Probably the most effective way of finding mussels is to put on a mask and snorkel and get down in the river. But it's the end of April, the water is still kind of chilly, and so I've got my waders on here. An almost equally effective way of finding mussels if the water's not too deep is with a bucket like this. So this is just a regular 5-gallon bucket. I've cut the bottom out, and I've put a piece of clear plexiglass in there, glued it in there, sealed it with some silicone, and you can push this down into the water, and it cuts the glare off the surface, and you can look down at the bottom of the creek. So let's head out and see what we can find. So I found a few, thank goodness. So here's one called a 3 ridge. You can see it's got these really interesting ridges on the shell. This one's all covered with algae and stuff. And there's these little cases on the shell. These are the cases of a caddisfly, an insect larvae. So that's another important ecological role of mussels, is that their shells, they provide habitat for a lot of other animals. So I also found a mussel called a spike. It's kind of a pretty shell here. These get big, maybe, about that long. And I found another thing that we really like to see. I found a few baby mussels, and this is important because a lot of streams, they don't have a lot of recruitment or a lot of reproduction, it seems like. Mostly what you, find are big old adult mussels, and there doesn't seem like there's much coming in to replace them. So it's kind of like a forest where there's no young trees coming up in the forest floor. But I found a baby spike here, like the one I showed you a minute ago. And here's a couple of other baby pocket bugs. So these individuals here, they probably were born last year in the summer, and so they're just starting out on their first full year of life. So it's nice to see these little babies. Here's another thing I found. In past episodes on this show, you've had people talk about all the invasive plants in forests. Well, we actually have invasive bivalves also here in Kentucky. This is a thing called an Asian clam. These arrived in Kentucky in the mid-60s, early 60s, and they're now one of the most ubiquitous bivalves across the whole state. They're the dominant bivalves in many streams. So you can tell these apart from native mussels because the Asian clams have these strong concentric ridges on the shell. I can't focus on it, but if you run your fingernail across it, there's these strong ridges. So people often get excited. They say they found freshwater mussels in a creek, but it's often these Asian clams. And like I said, they're pretty common across the whole state. So I hope by now I've convinced you that mussels are fascinating and important and just plain cool. The sad thing about mussels is that they're disappearing in many places. Of the 300 North American species, almost 100 are listed as endangered or threatened, and about another 100 are in trouble at some level. So about 2/3 of our mussel fauna is in trouble. If you recall earlier, I told you that this part of Elkhorn Creek here has about 20 mussel species now. Well, 50 years ago, there were 25 or 30 species, maybe even a few more. So even though there's still a lot of mussels here, we've lost a substantial portion of the fauna that ought to be here. And this is the case across Kentucky. Almost all streams in the state have lost a substantial portion of the fauna that was there originally. What's even more concerning is that other streams have lost their mussel fauna almost entirely. For example, a stream where I've worked a lot in Jackson and Rockcastle counties, in the last 25 years, mussel abundance in that stream has declined about 98%. That stream originally had about 23 mussel species, including 2 endangered species, which at that time, the populations of those 2 species in the creek were about the largest left on Earth. Well, now there's about 2 or 3 species just barely hanging on in this creek. Those 2 endangered species appear to be gone, and mussels are just almost entirely eliminated in the creek. We're seeing this in other places, other parts of the Rockcastle River system, the Noland River, parts of the Green River system, out in western Kentucky, in the Little River and the Red River. So remember, when we lose mussels in a stream, we also lose all those important ecosystem benefits that they provide. Unfortunately, we don't know why mussels are disappearing or dying out in these streams. So that's a big part of my job. I and people in other states, other countries, are trying to understand why mussels are disappearing in some places and why streams like Elkhorn Creek here have lost a part of their mussel fauna. So we hope that if we can understand better what the causes of these mussel declines are, land managers, whether it's the U.S. Forest Service or Kentucky Fish and Wildlife or other agencies and organizations, we hope they can use that information to correct the problem and to restore populations of mussels in our streams.